You're listening to a production of the National Media Archive. To learn more or volunteer, go to nationalmediaarchive.com.
Edward Snowden. Not a spy thriller character, but a contractor who turned the world's most secretive surveillance programs inside out. A 29-year-old analyst for the National Security Agency, the NSA, who grabbed nearly 1 million top-secret documents and waited in a Hong Kong hotel for journalists he barely knew, gambling that the truth was worth the cost. Inside that hotel room, Snowden blocked door cracks with pillows, worried someone might listen in from the hallway. He pulled a red hood over his head and laptop while typing passwords, afraid of hidden cameras. That's not paranoia for effect. That's a man living under the weight of what he carried. The documents exposed how the NSA, under the banner of fighting terrorism, was scooping up the phone records and internet data of millions without their knowledge. It wasn't just who people called. It was how the agency could follow lives in real time, mapping relationships, interests, and routines with machine precision. When the stories first hit, Snowden didn't reveal his identity. For a moment, he watched from the shadows as the world learned how deep the surveillance went, how the plumbing of global communication was rerouted through government filters, collecting data as easily as drawing water from a tap. Then Snowden stepped forward, attaching his name and face to the leak. That move changed him from an anonymous source into the most wanted man on the planet. The United States government labeled him a traitor, a criminal, and the Justice Department moved quickly, unsealing charges of espionage, theft, and unauthorized disclosure of national defense information. Snowden understood exactly what that meant. He saw what happened to Chelsea Manning, who was held in solitary confinement for years after leaking military documents. He knew the stakes, knew the government would try to make an example out of him, to warn anyone else who might think about leaking classified material. Once he was named, the hunt was on. Journalists and intelligence agencies across the world tried to track him down. A clue in a Guardian video, a glimpse of a Hong Kong skyline, set off a frantic chase to pinpoint his location. While the United States pressured Hong Kong to detain Snowden, the local authorities delayed, caught between public support for Snowden's revelations and the reality of their relationship with Beijing. It was a game of waiting, as the paperwork for extradition moved through diplomatic channels. All the while, Snowden was stuck in limbo, unsure if he'd be dragged out of his hideout at any moment. As the United States dialed every number it could find, Snowden reached out to WikiLeaks, hoping the group that had withstood pressure over the Chelsea Manning leaks could help him slip away before it was too late. When Snowden fled the hotel, he left behind a city that had turned into a pressure cooker, with the media flooding lobbies and the US government working every angle to get him in custody. Meanwhile, WikiLeaks was booking decoy tickets, trying to scatter the intelligence dragnet, buying time for Snowden to move. He made it to the Hong Kong airport, moving quickly through passport control with the fear that every beep, every check, might end with agents taking him into custody. But a paperwork error by the US State Department, getting Snowden's middle name wrong on the documents, bought him the narrow window needed to board a flight out of Hong Kong. As the plane left the runway, the hunt shifted to the skies. Snowden's flight out of Hong Kong was the start of the largest intelligence manhunt the world had seen. Every agency was watching. Every phone line was active, as the United States tried to intercept him before he reached safe airspace. But as the plane climbed, Snowden and his WikiLeaks contact, Sarah Harrison, crossed the invisible line out of Hong Kong's reach, leaving behind the chaos in the airport terminal. The plan was never about Moscow. Snowden aimed for Latin America, hoping for asylum in countries like Venezuela or Bolivia. But the US had other plans, pressuring governments worldwide to deny him safe passage, working the phones to make sure no route would remain open. Every potential landing spot was a negotiation table, with the US leaning hard on allies to shut doors. In Moscow, Snowden discovered his passport had been cancelled mid-flight. It wasn't an accident. The United States had frozen him in place, trapping him in the transit zone of Sheremetyevo Airport. For days that turned into weeks, Snowden and Harrison were stuck in a windowless space, sleeping on airport benches, showering in public facilities, living in the uncertainty of what would come next. The Russian government made its position clear. Snowden could leave if he cooperated with their intelligence agency, the Federal Security Service. But Snowden refused, unwilling to trade one surveillance power for another. The Russians were not ready to let him into the country, and the United States kept pushing, demanding Snowden's return to face charges that could lock him away for decades. Meanwhile, Snowden's leaks continued to shake governments around the world. Each new revelation detailed the scale of the surveillance, showing how the NSA tapped into global internet infrastructure, partnered with major tech companies, and built systems to collect data on a massive scale, often without clear oversight or the knowledge of the people being surveilled. Snowden's situation was a global diplomatic mess. As he applied for asylum in 21 countries, most European nations turned him down under US pressure. Even those sympathetic to Snowden's cause were unwilling to risk their relationship with Washington. In Latin America, the offers of asylum came in, but Snowden was stuck without a safe route to reach them. The US made sure that any potential flight path was blocked, warning countries that allowing Snowden to pass through their airspace would have consequences. Then came the incident that showed the world just how far the United States would go. The plane carrying Bolivian President Evo Morales was forced to land in Vienna after rumors circulated that Snowden might be on board. The presidential jet, protected under diplomatic immunity, was searched, an act that outraged leaders across Latin America and revealed the lengths to which Washington would go to capture Snowden. It was a move that backfired, reinforcing the image of Snowden as a man hunted by a superpower willing to bend the rules to catch him. The world saw the imbalance of power, the pressure applied on allies, and the willingness to disrupt diplomatic norms to pursue a single individual who had exposed the government's mass surveillance programs. Inside the Moscow airport, Snowden watched the news, fully aware of how precarious his position was. The window to escape was closing, and the options were shrinking. Every move had to be calculated, every contact vetted, as the weight of global politics pressed down on a man who had chosen to reveal how the modern surveillance state truly operated. Then, after weeks of negotiations, Russia granted Snowden temporary asylum for 1 year. It wasn't freedom, but it was a lifeline. As he stepped out of the airport into the open air, the noise of traffic and the sight of the sky were reminders of a world he could no longer freely move through, even as he stood outside the terminal for the first time in weeks. Stepping out of Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport didn't mean stepping into a normal life for Edward Snowden. It meant a new type of confinement, one without airport walls, but still under the constant shadow of being hunted by the most powerful intelligence agencies on the planet. Inside Russia, Snowden's presence triggered a diplomatic cold front between Washington and Moscow. The United States, already strained in its relationship with Russia, saw the asylum as a direct challenge, fueling accusations and demands that Snowden be returned to face charges of espionage and theft of government property. Snowden knew the reality. Returning to the United States meant solitary confinement, a trial under the Espionage Act with no defense of public interest, and decades, if not life, behind bars. His decision to leak wasn't driven by a desire for fame or money. It was driven by what he discovered while working as a contractor for the National Security Agency and other parts of the United States intelligence community. Snowden saw firsthand how surveillance systems were expanding beyond targeting foreign threats. These systems were capturing the private communications of everyday people across the world, including American citizens, under the justification of national security. Metadata was being collected to build social graphs, map relationships, track locations, and monitor behaviors without warrants or transparency. At the core of these programs was the belief that any intrusion was acceptable, as long as it was technically possible. Secret courts approved sweeping orders, while the public remained unaware that their calls, texts, and online activity were all subject to silent collection. These revelations hit the tech industry hard. Companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft were shown to be participating in or complying with broad data sharing agreements under government pressure, sparking public outcry and debates about privacy, security, and the reach of the state. Snowden's leaks also revealed the program known as PRISM, which detailed how the NSA collected data from major internet services directly. Another program, XKeyscore, was exposed as a tool capable of searching through vast databases of emails, online chats, and browsing histories of millions worldwide with minimal oversight. Governments around the world responded with varying levels of outrage, concern, and quiet recalibration of their own surveillance practices. Allies were caught off guard, discovering the NSA had tapped into their leaders' communications and national networks, causing diplomatic tension in Europe and beyond. For citizens, it was a wake-up call about the fragility of digital privacy in a world where technology moved faster than the laws designed to protect people from abuse of power. Encryption, once a niche concern, became a mainstream discussion, with calls for stronger protections and greater accountability. While the media often framed Snowden as either a traitor or a hero, the documents spoke for themselves, laying bare the scale and methods of mass surveillance and sparking a global debate about the balance between security and civil liberties in the digital age. Snowden's choice came with a cost. Unable to return home, separated from family and the life he once knew, he lived under the reality that any misstep could lead to capture or worse. Yet, despite this, he stood by his decision, believing that the public had the right to know what was being done in its name and against its privacy. As the world continued to process the impact of the disclosures, the United States government maintained its stance, refusing to entertain the idea of a pardon or leniency, insisting that Snowden's leaks caused harm to national security, despite ongoing debates about the benefits of the public conversation they forced. The surveillance programs exposed by Snowden weren't new in concept, but the scale, reach, and secrecy surrounding them defined a new era of state power in the digital age. And Snowden's actions ensured that era could not continue without public scrutiny. As Snowden settled into his new restricted life in Russia, the waves from his disclosures continued to spread. Journalists worked through the nearly 1 million classified documents, publishing stories that detailed how the surveillance network reached into every corner of digital life. Programs like Boundless Informant, which tracked global data collection, revealed how the National Security Agency was not simply monitoring suspected threats, but was systematically gathering information across entire nations. Allies and adversaries alike were under surveillance, with documents showing that leaders in Germany, Brazil, and Mexico were targets, causing diplomatic rifts that could not be easily smoothed over. Inside the United States, the public learned that their phone records were collected in bulk under Section 215 of the Patriot Act. The justification was to find connections between potential threats, but in reality, it meant ordinary citizens' calls were logged without their knowledge or consent, creating a data reservoir that the government could search when it chose. The reaction was sharp. Civil liberties groups, privacy advocates, and a growing segment of the public called for reforms. Lawsuits challenged the constitutionality of mass surveillance, and Congress faced pressure to justify programs that had been hidden behind classified markings and legal interpretations unknown to the public. Technology companies, facing backlash from customers, began to push back. Encryption standards were strengthened, and transparency reports became the norm, with companies disclosing how many government data requests they received and how they responded. Apple and Google announced plans to implement stronger device encryption, positioning privacy as a selling point in a post-Snowden world. The global debate also led to legislative changes. The USA Freedom Act, passed in 2015, aimed to end the bulk collection of phone metadata by the National Security Agency, instead requiring more targeted data collection with oversight. While critics argued it didn't go far enough, it was a sign that the status quo had been disrupted. Meanwhile, Snowden remained a polarizing figure. Intelligence officials labeled him a criminal and a danger, blaming him for damage to operations and strained alliances. His supporters viewed him as a whistleblower who exposed the unchecked growth of surveillance power, sparking necessary discussions about the future of privacy in a connected world. The tension extended beyond the legal system. Snowden's situation underscored the limits of whistleblower protections in the United States, particularly under the Espionage Act, which offers no public interest defense. For those inside the intelligence community who saw wrongdoing and wanted to expose it, the Snowden case served as a warning that coming forward meant risking everything, with little chance of a fair trial. Globally, the revelations highlighted the vulnerability of Internet infrastructure. Undersea cables, data centers, and major technology companies were points of collection for intelligence agencies. The partnership between the United States and allied intelligence agencies, known as the Five Eyes Alliance, demonstrated how surveillance efforts extended across borders, pooling resources to monitor the digital activities of billions. Snowden's disclosures pushed the conversation about privacy from the fringes to the center of public debate. Encryption, data security, government accountability, and the limits of surveillance became issues that lawmakers, companies, and citizens could no longer ignore. Through it all, Snowden's message was clear. It was not about him, but about the rights of people to understand and challenge the systems that operate in their name. The cost of revealing the truth was his freedom, and his future remained uncertain. But the impact of the disclosures reshaped how the world viewed the intersection of technology, security, and liberty. Snowden's escape to Russia didn't end the pursuit. It shifted it into a long game. The United States applied pressure on Russia to expel him, framing the situation as a matter of law enforcement, while continuing to brand Snowden as a fugitive and a traitor. In Russia, Snowden was granted temporary asylum, extended year by year, allowing him to live relatively quietly while remaining a symbolic lightning rod in global debates over surveillance and privacy. The Russian government, under President Vladimir Putin, publicly rejected Snowden's request for a normal life, denying him the freedom to move beyond Russian borders without risking arrest. Meanwhile, the revelations kept coming. Disclosures showed how the NSA and its partners developed tools to break encryption or bypass it entirely, compromising the security of global internet traffic. Techniques for intercepting shipments to install surveillance hardware, exploiting software vulnerabilities, and embedding themselves within the hardware supply chain demonstrated the depth of the surveillance state's reach. The documents exposed how intelligence services partnered with telecommunications companies to tap into undersea cables, capturing vast flows of global internet data. It became clear that surveillance was not targeted but systemic, with the goal of collecting everything possible and analyzing it later, regardless of the privacy rights of individuals or the sovereignty of nations. Snowden's case became a touchstone for discussions around whistleblowing, the accountability of intelligence agencies, and the balance between security and freedom. For many, the disclosures highlighted the disconnect between public statements made by government leaders and the hidden realities of surveillance practices. The impact was not limited to the United States. In Europe, leaders expressed outrage after learning they had been targeted by NSA surveillance, leading to tensions in diplomatic relations. Germany, in particular, was angered by reports that Chancellor Angela Merkel's phone had been tapped. Brazil's President Dilma Rousseff condemned the surveillance of Brazilian citizens and industries, calling it a violation of sovereignty. The technology sector, under scrutiny after being named in surveillance programs like PRISM, faced pressure to improve security measures. Companies began to adopt end-to-end encryption in messaging apps, and secure communication tools became more accessible to the public. The Snowden leaks accelerated a shift toward privacy-focused technology and forced companies to publicly define their positions on cooperating with government surveillance requests. Public sentiment was split. Some viewed Snowden as a traitor who endangered lives and operations, while others saw him as a defender of constitutional rights, exposing an overreaching surveillance state that operated in secrecy. The debate often centered on whether the disclosures harmed national security or strengthened democracy by revealing hidden abuses of power. Within the United States, attempts to reform surveillance laws were slow and met with resistance. While the USA Freedom Act addressed some aspects of bulk data collection, broader surveillance powers remained intact, with intelligence agencies arguing that these capabilities were necessary for national security. Snowden's disclosures also underscored the legal challenges faced by whistleblowers in the intelligence community. Under the Espionage Act, there was no avenue for Snowden to argue that his actions served the public interest, leaving him with the choice of facing prosecution without a fair defense or seeking refuge abroad. For Snowden, life in Russia was marked by limited freedom and constant awareness of his precarious situation. His partner, Lindsay Mills, later joined him in Moscow, allowing for some semblance of personal stability, but the reality remained that returning home would mean prison, with no promise of a fair hearing. The world continued to grapple with the implications of the surveillance program Snowden exposed. Privacy advocates pushed for stronger protections, governments re-evaluated the limits of surveillance powers, and the public became more conscious of digital security in a world where data collection had become the norm. The Snowden disclosures changed the conversation about privacy and surveillance permanently, forcing governments, corporations, and citizens to confront the realities of living in a digital age where data is both power and vulnerability. Snowden's leaks didn't just reveal the scope of surveillance. They exposed the architecture of global control through data, built quietly over decades. These programs were designed to collect everything: emails, phone records, internet browsing, and the metadata that ties lives together invisibly. The public learned that surveillance wasn't a narrow tool used sparingly against terrorism. It was a net cast across the globe, justified by the logic that any data might be useful one day. The tools were advanced, leveraging secret court orders, technical exploits, and partnerships with corporations to build a database of human behavior at a scale previously unimaginable. Under programs like XKeyscore, analysts could pull up emails, browsing histories, and chats with minimal oversight. With PRISM, the National Security Agency accessed data directly from major technology companies, including Google, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft, under court orders, collecting content and metadata from users worldwide. Snowden's documents showed that surveillance extended to journalists, activists, and even allied governments, proving that the net was indiscriminate. Documents revealed spying on leaders, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel, sparking diplomatic conflicts and public debates about the ethics of intelligence gathering. At the same time, the disclosures forced the technology industry to confront its role in the surveillance machine. Companies faced public backlash and legal challenges, pushing them to adopt stronger encryption, transparency measures, and resistance to blanket government data requests. Messaging apps began implementing end-to-end encryption, making private communication more accessible to ordinary people. The revelations highlighted the imbalance between government power and individual rights in the digital age. Governments justified mass data collection as necessary for national security, while critics argued that these programs eroded privacy and civil liberties, creating systems ripe for abuse without transparency or accountability. Inside the intelligence community, Snowden's actions were viewed as betrayal. Officials argued that the leaks damaged operations, exposed methods, and compromised national security. Yet, despite these claims, the documents prompted no clear evidence of operational harm to the public, while sparking necessary global debates about privacy and oversight. For the public, the disclosures were a wake-up call, demonstrating that privacy was not a default right in the digital world, but something that needed to be actively defended. The idea that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, crumbled when people realized how much of their lives were subject to silent observation. Snowden's situation became a symbol of the risks faced by whistleblowers, particularly in the intelligence sector. The Espionage Act left no room for a public interest defense, creating a system where exposing wrongdoing within classified systems meant facing severe punishment without a fair trial. In Russia, Snowden lived in a paradox, physically free but constrained, a symbol of resistance while isolated from his home and the democratic system he aimed to protect. The Russian government's decision to grant asylum wasn't about supporting Snowden's cause. It was a geopolitical maneuver, using his presence as leverage in an already strained relationship with the United States. Snowden's partner, Lindsay Mills, joined him in Russia, allowing for a life with some degree of normalcy. Yet, the reality of exile was clear. The cost of revealing the truth was permanent separation from home, friends, and family. Meanwhile, Snowden's story was told in books, films, and documentaries, spreading his message further. He continued to speak out remotely, participating in conferences and discussions, advocating for privacy, whistleblower protections, and the need for systemic reforms to safeguard rights in the digital age. The conversation about privacy was permanently changed. Encryption, once seen as niche, became mainstream. People learned to question the trade-offs they made when using technology, recognizing that convenience often came at the price of surveillance. The Snowden leaks forced a reckoning. Governments, corporations, and individuals could no longer ignore the reality that the infrastructure of the internet was being used to monitor and record lives at scale, often without consent or oversight. By the time Snowden had spent years in exile, the global conversation had shifted. Surveillance was no longer a conspiracy theory, it was established fact. Every major tech company had to answer for its role. Every government had to justify the line it walked between security and civil liberty. But even as Snowden's leaks forced transparency and sparked reforms, the structural imbalance remained. Intelligence agencies had not dismantled the systems, they evolved them. The push for stronger encryption was met with pushback from law enforcement demanding backdoors. Governments quietly expanded surveillance under new legal frameworks, often just repackaging old powers in updated language. In the United States, public opinion remained split. Politicians across the spectrum acknowledged that Snowden had sparked important debates, but still called him a criminal. Some argued for clemency. Others said that even suggesting leniency would undermine trust in the intelligence community, where over 100,000 people had kept secrets as part of their jobs. The message was clear. Whistleblowing in the intelligence world remained high risk, with no legal path for safe disclosure of government misconduct. Snowden's case was treated as the example not to follow. Diplomatically, the Snowden episode marked a fracture. The grounding of Bolivian President Evo Morales' plane over a rumor that Snowden was on board shattered assumptions about diplomatic norms. Latin America erupted in outrage, while Europe looked complicit for denying airspace and access. It revealed the reach of American influence and the cost of crossing it. For Snowden, there was no return, not without a guarantee of a fair trial, which, under the Espionage Act, did not exist. He remained in Russia, eventually receiving permanent residency. He kept a low profile, occasionally appearing virtually to comment on privacy issues and surveillance laws, but largely staying out of the political spotlight. His physical safety was no longer in immediate danger, but his freedom was still bound by borders, politics, and the threat of prosecution. He never profited from the disclosures. He never sold state secrets. The documents went to journalists who filtered, redacted, and published them in the public interest. Yet the charges against him were the same as if he had handed them to a foreign government. Meanwhile, the stories revealed through his leaks kept influencing policy and tech. Cloud storage companies, smartphone manufacturers, and messaging apps redesigned how they protected user data. Lawmakers faced growing pressure to defend civil liberties in the digital sphere. Still, the surveillance state did not vanish. Its tools became more discreet, its arguments more sophisticated. It expanded into private tech partnerships and artificial intelligence systems that could scan, flag, and analyze communications in real time. The goal was no longer just surveillance. It was prediction. Snowden's disclosures didn't end the game. They just made the rules visible. When the pandemic hit in 2020, debates over digital tracking and contact tracing reignited concerns about mass surveillance. The infrastructure was already there. The question became whether people trusted governments to use it responsibly. In exile, Snowden remained a divisive figure. Some saw him as a digital age dissident, others as a security threat. But even those who disagreed with his methods often admitted that without the leaks, the public would never have known the full extent of the surveillance system built in its name. His story became more than a personal saga. It became a warning that in a world run on data, the ability to watch everyone, all the time, had become real. And once that capability exists, it rarely goes away.